15-second hook. People laughed at the donkey because it was slow, weak, and silent. No one imagined that one ordinary morning, this forgotten animal would become the reason a human heart kept beating. This is not just a story about a donkey. It's a story about hope, kindness, and how heroes are sometimes born where no one is looking. The village of Red Willow sat quietly between dusty hills and open farmland, the kind of place where time moved slowly and every sunrise looked almost the same as the one before it. Roosters crowed at dawn, wooden doors creaked open, and villagers stepped into their routines as if following an invisible script they had memorized long ago. In this village lived a small gray donkey named Milo. Milo was not strong like the oxen, nor fast like the horses. His legs were thin. His ears were always bent slightly forward, and his eyes carried a softness that made people overlook him. Children laughed when he brayed. Farmers sighed when they saw him. To most villagers, Milo was just another useless mouth to feed. He belonged to an old man named Jacob, a poor farmer whose hands were rough from years of labor and whose back bent a little more each season. Jacob never mistreated Milo, but even he believed the donkey was weak. Milo was used only for light tasks, carrying small bundles of firewood or slow walks to the market. When the work became hard, Jacob would pat Milo's neck and whisper, "It's okay, old friend. You're not made for heavy things." Milo didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, and he understood loneliness. Every day, Milo watched the village from the edge of the field. He saw laughter, arguments, kindness, and cruelty. He noticed things others didn't: the sound of approaching storms, the way birds flew low when danger came, and the emotions in human voices. Though no one knew it, Milo felt deeply. One afternoon, as the sun leaned toward the western hills, Jacob prepared for a short journey to a neighboring village. He loaded Milo with a small sack of grain and tied the rope gently. The road ahead was narrow and climbed into rocky terrain. Jacob hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "We'll go slow," he said. They walked together step by step, the dust rising softly under Milo's hooves. The hills grew steeper, the air thinner. Halfway up the path, Jacob stopped to rest, his breathing heavy. Milo stood still, sensing something was wrong. Jacob's hand trembled as he leaned against a rock. "I'm just tired," Jacob muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. Moments later, Jacob collapsed. The sack fell, grain spilling onto the ground. Jacob lay motionless, his eyes half open, his chest barely rising. Milo froze. His ears twitched. His heart pounded in his chest. No one was there. No voices. No footsteps. Only wind. Milo nudged Jacob with his nose. No response. He nudged harder, then brayed loudly, the sound echoing through the hills. Still nothing. Fear filled Milo in a way he had never felt before. But with it came something else: determination. Milo remembered the village. He remembered people. Help. Without hesitation, Milo turned and ran. His legs trembled as he moved faster than he ever had. Stones cut into his hooves, thorns scraped his sides, but he didn't slow down. He brayed again and again, his voice sharp and urgent, unlike the lazy sounds people were used to hearing. Down the hill, into the village, Milo burst through the familiar paths. Villagers looked up in surprise. A donkey running alone was strange enough, but this donkey's eyes were wild with purpose. Milo ran to the well, braying loudly. He ran past the marketplace, knocking over baskets. Finally, he stopped in front of the healer's home and refused to move, stamping his feet and crying out. Something in his voice made people pause. "This isn't normal," someone whispered. They followed Milo. Back up the hill they went, guided by the donkey who never once looked back to see if they were still coming. When they reached Jacob, panic spread. The healer knelt quickly, checking his pulse. "He's alive," she said. "But barely." They carried Jacob back on a makeshift stretcher, Milo walking beside them, never leaving his side. That night, candles burned late, prayers were whispered, and slowly, miraculously, Jacob's breathing grew stronger. By morning, Jacob opened his eyes. And the first thing he saw was Milo, standing quietly near the bed. Tears filled the old man's eyes. "You saved me," he whispered. Word spread through the village. People looked at Milo differently now. Children stopped laughing. Farmers nodded with respect. They saw not weakness, but courage. Milo didn't understand praise. He only understood that kindness had finally been returned. And the village would never forget the donkey who refused to walk Awa. Way. Part 2. The morning after Jacob opened his eyes, the village of Red Willow felt different. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the air that only the most observant could sense. The same sun rose over the hills, the same birds sang from the trees, but people walked more slowly, more thoughtfully, as if something inside them had been gently rearranged. Milo stood outside Jacob's small wooden house, tied loosely to a post. No one had thought to move him. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. All night, he had listened to the sounds inside. The soft breathing, the murmured voices, the healer's calm instructions. Every sound mattered to him. When the door finally opened, Milo lifted his head. Jacob stepped out carefully, leaning on a wooden staff. His face was pale, his movements slow, but his eyes were clear. When he saw Milo, he stopped. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Jacob smiled. He crossed the short distance and rested his forehead against Milo's. His hand trembled as it stroked the donkey's rough gray fur. "I never thanked you," Jacob said quietly. "I never really saw you." Milo breathed out softly, his ears flicking forward. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the warmth, the gratitude, the change. By midday, the story had traveled beyond Red Willow. Travelers repeated it on dusty roads. Merchants spoke of it at inns. A weak donkey, a dying man, a miracle born of loyalty. Some believed it, some didn't. But everyone talked about it. Children began visiting Milo, bringing apples and carrots, sitting beside him in the shade. First, Milo was wary. He had known laughter before, and not the kind that came with kindness. But these children were different. Their voices were gentle, their hands careful. One small girl named Clara became his favorite. She talked to him as if he were a person, telling him about her dreams, her fears, and how she wanted to become a healer one day. "You're brave," she told him one afternoon, pressing her forehead against his nose. "Braver than anyone." Milo closed his eyes. Jacob's recovery was slow. Some days were better than others. There were moments when pain twisted his face, when exhaustion forced him back to bed. But Milo never left his side. When Jacob rested, Milo rested. When Jacob struggled, Milo stood closer. The healer noticed. "Animals feel more than we think," she said one evening. "Sometimes more than we do." Life slowly returned to its rhythm, but Milo's role in the village had changed. People no longer pushed past him or spoke of him as useless. They asked Jacob about him. They greeted Milo by name. Still, not everyone believed the story. One man in particular, a trader named Vincent, scoffed whenever it was mentioned. Vincent was tall, loud, and proud. He owned strong horses and expensive goods, and he believed worth could be measured by strength and speed. "A donkey saving a life," he laughed one day in the marketplace. "Animals don't think. They react. You're all romanticizing coincidence." Milo stood nearby, chewing hay, unaware of the words but aware of the tone. Vincent's voice was sharp, dismissive, the kind Milo remembered well. That same week, dark clouds gathered over the hills. Storms were rare in Red Willow, but when they came fiercely. The wind howled through narrow paths, and rain fell in sheets, turning trails into rivers of mud. Villagers stayed indoors, fires burning low, waiting for it to pass. Vincent did not wait. He had business in the mountain pass, and he trusted his horses. He left early, ignoring warnings, confident as ever. Milo watched him go. There was something in the air that made Milo uneasy. The birds had gone silent. The wind smelled sharp. He shifted his weight, ears twitching, heart restless. Hours passed. The storm worsened. Late that evening, shouting echoed faintly from the hills, thin, broken, almost lost in the wind. Milo lifted his head. Again. Cry. Weak. Desperate. Milo brayed loudly, the sound cutting through the rain. Jacob, sitting by the fire, looked up sharply. "What is it, Milo?" he asked. Milo pulled at the rope, his body tense, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Jacob stood slowly. His body protested, but he trusted the donkey now in a way he never had before. "Get the lantern," Jacob called to a neighbor. "Something's wrong." They followed Milo into the storm. Rain soaked their clothes. Mud clung to their boots. The path was dangerous, slick with water and loose stones. More than once, someone nearly fell. But Milo moved carefully, confidently, as if he knew exactly where to place each hoof. Far up the pass they found Vincent. One of his horses had slipped, fallen hard, and injured its leg. The other had bolted. Vincent lay against a rock, his leg twisted unnaturally, his voice nearly gone. When he saw Milo, confusion crossed his face. "The donkey," he whispered. They carried Vincent back, the storm easing just enough to allow safe passage. The healer worked through the night again, setting bones, stopping bleeding. Vincent survived. When he woke, shame filled his eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly to Jacob. "About everything." Milo stood nearby, silent as always. From that day on, Vincent changed. He spoke more softly. He listened more. And whenever he passed Milo, he bowed his head slightly in respect. Seasons passed. Red Willow grew kinder, not just to animals but to each other. People helped without being asked. They paid attention. They listened. Milo aged. His steps slowed. His coat lightened with gray. But his presence remained steady, comforting. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and amber, Jacob sat beside Milo in the field. "You taught us something," Jacob said. "Not with words. With actions." Milo leaned gently against him. And in that quiet moment, the village understood something it had long forgotten, that greatness is not loud, strength is not always visible, and heroes do not always stand on two legs. Part 3. The years that followed passed gently in Red Willow, like pages turning without resistance. Life did not become perfect, but it became more aware. People noticed small things now: the tired look in a neighbor's eyes, the way an animal flinched at sudden noise, the warning signs of storms before clouds even formed. And at the quiet center of this change stood Milo. Age had softened him. His once dark gray coat had lightened, and white hairs framed his eyes and muzzle. His steps were slower, careful, but still steady. Children who once brought him apples had grown taller, their voices deeper, yet they still greeted him as they passed. Some rested their hands on his neck for comfort, as if Milo carried calm within him. Jacob had grown older too. His back bent more now. His hands shook on cold mornings, but he was alive. And he never forgot why. Every evening, Jacob and Milo walked to the same hill overlooking the village. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, rich with shared memory. One autumn afternoon, as leaves drifted down like quiet thoughts, Clara, now a young woman, approached them. She carried a small bag of herbs and wore the simple robe of an apprentice healer. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said softly. Jacob looked up, surprised. "Leaving?" Clara nodded. "The city. I've been invited to study under a master healer. It's a chance I can't refuse." Milo watched her closely. He sensed the mixture of excitement and fear in her voice. "I wanted to say goodbye," she continued, kneeling beside Milo. She pressed her forehead to his, just as she had when she was a child. "You were my first lesson. Compassion before knowledge. Presence before power." Milo breathed slowly, his ears flicking once. That night, Red Willow held a small gathering for Clara. Lanterns glowed, food was shared, laughter rose. But beneath it all was the understanding that change was coming, not just for Clara, but for the village. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the hills in thick, unforgiving layers. Paths disappeared. The wind cut sharply, and supplies grew scarce. Villagers rationed food, shared what little they had, and stayed close to their fires. Milo struggled more in the cold. His joints stiffened. Some mornings he took longer to stand. Jacob noticed and worried, wrapping old blankets around him, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure Milo could hear. One night, the storm was worse than any before. The wind screamed through red willow, rattling doors and snapping branches. Snow fell sideways, blinding and relentless. Even the bravest villagers stayed inside. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the storm. Jacob hesitated. He was warm, tired, afraid of what might wait beyond the door. But Milo lifted his head sharply, ears straight, eyes alert. The knock came again. Jacob opened the door. A woman collapsed at his feet, half buried in snow, her breath shallow, her arms wrapped around a small bundle. "My baby," she whispered before losing consciousness. Panic surged. Jacob shouted for help. Neighbors rushed in, wrapping the woman in blankets, checking the child. A tiny girl, cold but alive. "The pass," someone said. "She must have come through the pass in this storm." "The healer is away," another replied. "There's no one." Milo brayed loudly. All eyes turned to him. The baby's cries were weak. The woman's pulse was faint. Time mattered. Jacob's heart raced. He looked at Milo, then at the storm beyond the door. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." They prepared quickly. Sled, lanterns, ropes. Milo was brought forward, blankets secured around his body. His breath visible in the freezing air. "You don't have to," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. "You've done enough." Milo stepped forward anyway. The journey through the storm was brutal. Snow stung their faces. Wind threatened to knock them off balance. But Milo moved with purpose, each step deliberate, guided by instinct and memory. He had walked these paths his whole life. He knew where danger hid. At one point, the wind howled so fiercely that Jacob nearly lost his footing. Milo stopped instantly, bracing himself until the others regained balance. Hours felt like days. When they finally reached shelter near the lower hills, the baby cried louder. The woman stirred. They had made it. By morning the storm eased. The woman survived. The child was strong. But Milo did not rise. He lay quietly and the shelter, his breathing slow, shallow. Exhaustion had finally claimed what age and weather had been wearing away. Jacob knelt beside him, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Stay with me," he pleaded. "Please." Milo opened his eyes. He looked at Jacob, at the people gathered around, at the baby cradled safely in warm arms. His ears flicked once. Then he rested. Milo lived, but he was never the same. He no longer worked. He no longer walked the hills. He stayed near Jacob's home, resting in the sun, surrounded by care. Children brushed his coat. Adults brought him food. He was no longer a tool, no longer overlooked. He was family. In the quiet months that followed, Red Willow changed again, not through crisis but through reflection. People spoke of Milo not as a miracle, but as a reminder to act before doubt, to help without measuring worth, to listen, to animals, to instincts, to one another. One spring morning Clara returned. She knelt beside Milo, now thin and slow, and smiled through tears. "You did well," she whispered. "You taught us all." Milo breathed softly, the sound steady and calm. And in that moment, surrounded by life he had touched, Milo was no longer just a donkey. He was a story people would carry long after he was gone. Part 4. The spring after Clara's return was gentler than any Red Willow could remember. The snow melted slowly, feeding the streams instead of flooding them. Flowers grew along the hillsides, and the village breathed more easily, as if it had learned patience from the seasons themselves. Milo spent most days resting beneath the old fig tree beside Jacob's home. The tree had stood there longer than anyone could remember, its branches wide and protective. Sunlight filtered through its leaves, warming Milo's aging body. His breathing was slower now, deeper, each rise and fall deliberate. Jacob rarely left his side. He brought a small stool and sat with Milo, sometimes talking, sometimes simply listening to the world around them. He spoke about the past, the mistakes he'd made, the moments he wished he could change. He spoke about gratitude, about how strange it felt to still be alive when he had once been so close to leaving this world. "I used to think strength was in the body," Jacob said one afternoon, his voice soft. "Now I know it lives somewhere else." Milo's ears twitched gently. Visitors came often. Travelers who had heard the story wanted to see the donkey who saved lives. Some brought gifts, fruit, blankets, water bowls carved with care. Others brought silence, standing respectfully, unsure what to say. Milo accepted them all with the same calm presence. One evening Vincent arrived. He had changed even more over the years. His clothes were simpler, his voice quieter. He approached slowly, as if entering a sacred place. "I never thanked him properly," Vincent said to Jacob. He knelt beside Milo and placed a hand over his heart. "Because of you, I learned humility. Because of you, I learned to listen." Milo looked at him, eyes clear, then closed them again. That summer, Red Willow faced a different kind of challenge. Not sudden danger, but a slow test of character. A group of merchants proposed building a wide road through the nearby hills. It would bring trade, wealth, and recognition. But it would also cut through grazing land and disturb wildlife. The village argued. Some saw opportunity, others saw loss. At a gathering near the fig tree, voices rose, frustration spilling into the warm evening air. Jacob listened quietly, Milo resting beside him. Finally Jacob stood. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "This isn't about profit or fear. It's about who we've become." He gestured toward Milo. "This village learned compassion because we paid attention, because we chose care over convenience. If we forget that lesson now, then all of this meant nothing." Silence followed. The road was never built. Instead, Red Willow invested in smaller paths, shared trade, sustainable growth. It wasn't as fast. It wasn't as profitable. But it felt right. Milo lived through the summer, then into autumn again. Each season felt like a gift no one expected. His strength faded, but his presence remained powerful. On a quiet evening, Clara sat beside him, now a fully trained healer. She examined him gently, her expression calm but knowing. "He's comfortable," she said to Jacob. "But he's tired." Jacob nodded. He had known this moment was coming, even as he hoped it wouldn't. That night the village gathered, not in fear, not in grief, but in gratitude. Lanterns were placed around the fig tree. No one spoke loudly. Children sat close to their parents. Adults held hands. Jacob lay beside Milo, his hand resting on the donkey's neck. "You can rest," he whispered. "We'll be okay." Milo opened his eyes one last time. He looked at the people, at the lanterns, at the sky darkening into stars. His breathing slowed. And then peace. When the sun rose, Milo did not. The village mourned, but it did not break. Tears were shed, but smiles appeared too. Soft, remembering smiles. Milo was buried beneath the fig tree, where the earth was warm and familiar. A small stone was placed there. No name, no title, just a simple carving. He paid attention. Life continued. Children grew. Travelers came and went. Seasons turned. But something permanent had taken root in Red Willow. A quiet understanding that kindness is an action, courage is a choice, and even the smallest soul can change the course of many lives. And every time the wind moved through the fig tree, people said they could feel him still. Final part. The fig tree stood quietly as the years moved forward, its roots deep in the soil where Milo rested. Time did what it always does. It softened grief and sharpened meaning. Red Willow never became famous, never turned into a busy town filled with noise and lights. And that was exactly why people remembered it. Jacob lived longer than anyone expected. He walked slower now, leaning heavily on his staff, but every morning he visited the fig tree. He spoke to Milo as if nothing had changed, about the weather, about the village, about the small joys that still surprised him. "You'd like this," he said one morning, smiling. "They're teaching the children to care for animals before they teach them to count." Red Willow had changed its ways quietly. Animals were treated as companions, not tools. Travelers were welcomed without suspicion. When someone fell, others reached out before being asked. No one ever announced these values. They were simply lived. Clara became the village healer and something more, a guide. People came to her not just for medicine but for wisdom. When asked where she learned compassion, she always gave the same answer. From a donkey who listened. Children who had never met Milo knew his story by heart. They reenacted it in play, pretending to bray warnings and lead invisible villagers through imagined storms. But their parents made sure they understood the truth beneath the tale. It wasn't magic, they said. It was attention. It was care. One autumn evening, many years later, Jacob did not come to the fig tree. They found him in his bed, peaceful, his hand resting on a small carved figure of a donkey Clara had given him long ago. He was buried beside Milo. No speeches were made. None were needed. The fig tree grew taller, stronger. Its shade widened, sheltering generations who sat beneath it, talking, listening, resting. Travelers who passed through Red Willow often asked why the village felt different, why it felt calm, why people seemed kinder. The answer was never long. "Once," someone would say, "we learned a lesson the hard way. And we chose not to forget it. Because hope does not always arrive loudly. Kindness does not always look powerful. And heroes do not always walk on two legs. Sometimes they stand quietly on four, ignored, underestimated, until the moment comes when the world needs them most. And when that moment comes, they simply act." If this story touched your heart, remember this. Kindness doesn't need strength, size, or a loud voice. Sometimes the smallest soul can change the biggest fate. If you believe in hope, compassion, and silent heroes, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a little light today. Until next time, stay kind, stay humble, and never underestimate anyone.